Good afternoon, universe. How's it hanging? I'm iApple Guy, Character King, Fat Hag and Drag Kingsley. What's up? So, here I am back on the elliptical again. What's on my mind today? For some reason, I'm on a governmental rant, and I hate talking about government too much because it takes away from entertainment, but this is kind of on my mind a lot lately. I've been reading a book called Blood on the Moon. It's around the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and I find it really interesting in a number of ways. It kind of is this, it was written back in the early 2000s, and it, addresses all the conspiracies out there regarding, for example, how they railroaded a doctor by the name of Samuel Mudd. In case you've ever heard the phrase, his name is Mudd. That's a reference to that guy. But this author, historian, actually sort of says how Samuel Mudd was actually very involved in the plot to help John Wilkes Booth escape. So this book was written back in the 2000s, and this is going to kind of encompass television, this conversation, because one of the things that's really interesting to me is historical artifacts. So keep that book in mind. I'll come back to it in a second. Pawn Stars, if you've ever seen it, I've watched it on Amazon Prime. And one of the episodes had an episode where this gentleman brought in a bill, like a flyer. It was not called a flyer back then, but a playbill. He brought in a playbill from the Ford Theater for April 14th, Good Friday, 1865, which was the night that Lincoln was assassinated. And on the playbill, it mentions, that President Lincoln was going to be in attendance. Now this was in, I want to say, 2008 or 2009. So it's years after this book was written that I've been reading Blood on the Moon. Well, in the book Blood on the Moon, they mention how Lincoln's name was on the playbill because it was supposed to be a star-studded night for this certain actress who I suppose was retiring, as I recall. And it was supposed to be a big night for her. Of course, I can't remember her name. But how Lincoln was promoted on the playbill along with Grant. Ulysses Grant, who was basically the new general of the Union military at that point. He had taken over, and he was the one who was, under his leadership on the field. That is why, the Union really won the war. Because they weren't losing, but they weren't winning before. They're sort of in a stalemate with Lee's army and Jefferson Davis's army. Jefferson Davis was the president of the Confederacy back in the time. Robert E. Lee was the general of the Confederate Army. So, just in case you don't know that part of history. So anyways, Ulysses S. Grant came in, and his leadership started to help the Union win the war. So he was sort of a rising celebrity in the Union. And of course, Abraham Lincoln was the president, so he was huge back then. So on this playbill, or in the book they talk about, in the early 2000s, this book was published, right? Early 2000s, I think it was like 2001. They talk about how, in addition to promoting this actress for her, I guess, farewell from the stage, they were promoting the fact that they had Lincoln and Grant in attendance that night. Or were planning to have Lincoln and Grant in attendance that night. So, what I found interesting is, jumping back to Pawn Stars, this playbill that this guy brought in said that Lincoln and Grant were listed on the playbill as being in attendance for the night. Well, as the episode goes along, and they, try to determine if this is a real piece of history, the main guy, well, I can't remember his name right now. The main guy on Pawn Stars, what is his name? Why can't I remember his name right now? But the main guy, he tells the person who brought in the playbill, well, this actually isn't real. It's a fake. It's it's sort of a reproduction of the original playbill, because they did not know that Lincoln and Grant were actually going to be in attendance that evening. That's sort of a false expectation or falsehood of history, that they were not originally promoted to be there, though that this playbill was obviously a reproduction. Well, I find it interesting that Pawn Stars 8 years later talks about how Lincoln and Grant weren't actually supposed to be there, and so they weren't promoted. And yet this book back in the early 2000s talks about how Lincoln and Grant were supposed to be there and were thus promoted on the playbill. So fast forward, because if you are not aware, there was this, and I hate to use the word conspiracy, because people immediately think you're crazy if you use the word conspiracy. They're like, it's like a Mel Gibson's movie, or Alex Jones, if you've ever seen him. I actually spoke to Alex Jones once or twice, sort of off of the air. And Alex Jones is, believe it or not, now this was 10 years ago. Alex Jones is actually not that bad of a guy. He's kind of goofy. Not in a, way, but he's real playful as a person. One of my phone calls with Alex Jones was, I was actually considering casting him in an independent movie that I was doing. Not as a conspiracy theorist, but just as sort of a country boy. Because he's got the twang and the whole thing. And so I considered casting him, and I left a message for him at the Austin Television Access Studios, which is where he really got his start. And he called me one night. I didn't know it was him at first, because the person was using a voice box, and he was going, "Hello, how are you doing?" It was some wacky thing. I'm like, who the is this? And so he thinks for a second, when he's calling me, he thought he was calling one of his friends, and he was trying to mess around with one of his friends. So he's obviously not psycho. He was just having fun with someone that he thought was a friend of his. Anyways, one of the other pieces that I remember from my conversation with him was the fact that he said, "I know people think I'm crazy." He said, "I know people think I'm crazy, and I know I get too agitated when I do my presentations." He said, "It's just because I'm so scared and I'm so worried about what's happening to the country." He said, I don't know how to get across to people how worried they should be about this stuff." So, anyways, that's a little offhand about Alex Jones, but I'm going to jump back a little bit now to the book and John Wilkes Booth thing. Because one of the theories that this book mentions is that John Wilkes Booth actually did not, one of the theories going around is that John Wilkes Booth did not die on the farm. Was it the farm called the Garrett Farm, which was like a tobacco farm? He did not die on the tobacco farm like they thought he did. That he had escaped and that someone else had taken his place, and that person was killed. And the theories revolve around the idea that John Wilkes Booth was actually worked sort of as an operative for the Confederacy and or potentially the Union because they did want to remove Lincoln from power. And the murder was sort of part of a government cover-up, so to speak. Well, this author goes through the process of disproving that theory. But I decided to look online and see what I could find about John Wilkes Booth and the conspiracy theory. And one of the things that came up, try and get through this quickly because I know my time is running out, is that back in the early 1870s, a man named Jack Booth married a woman named Louisa. Oh gosh, what am I going to remember her name? I can't remember her last name. I want to say it was Page or something. I don't think it was Page. But he married this woman, and he said that when they were getting married, he said, "Listen, I have to admit to you that I'm not really Jack Booth." He had proclaimed to be a relative of John Wilkes Booth. But then, as they got married, he said, "The truth is that I am actually John Wilkes Booth. And, I have a dark past." Well, she said she would still marry him, but she demanded that he put his real name on their marriage certificate. So when they got married in Tennessee, he put his name on the marriage certificate as John Wilkes Booth. Well, all this stuff proceeded to happen, and sort of danger for Wilkes being discovered. So he says, "I have to go." So he left, and he proceeded to go to Texas and somewhere else, and come under the assumed name of John St. Helen. Well, then things happened. He was supposed to go back to Louisa and her child, which was the young boy's name was McCager, but I think they called him Cage. He was supposed to go back to them, but he never did. He went instead from Texas. He went to Oklahoma and took on a new name of I want to say it was G. David George or something like that. I think that's what I'm pretty sure it was G. Davis George. G. David George. So anyway, he went there, and ultimately in 1903, he supposedly committed suicide in his 60s by drinking strychnine poison. Strychnine poison. Poison. That's the word. So it's real interesting because there was a book in the early 1900s written by Finis Bates. And Finis Bates was the grandfather of actress Kathy Bates. And supposedly the story goes is that while Wilkes, if let's call him John Wilkes, was living in the same area as Finis Bates, he admitted to Finis Bates, who was defending him in a circumstance, that he was actually John Wilkes Booth. And then he disappeared and da-da-da. And Finis wondered where John Wilkes went. And then after David George, I think that was his name. So many names in my head. After this other assumed name person that John Wilkes took on died, it made the papers because he had poisoned himself and committed suicide. And it got back to Finis, and he went and discovered that it actually was John Wilkes Booth. And that he ended up getting the body and supposedly kept it in his basement for a while he wrote this book called I think it was The Life and Suicide of John Wilkes Booth. Anyway, fast forward to the future after all this stuff. People started wondering, well, I guess I can't get into that right now. I promised 15 minutes. So I'll pick you up on the story tomorrow. Go look up John Wilkes Booth if you watch this and you're interested in it. And I'll talk more tomorrow about the family and what happened with that. Because it's a real fascinating story how they were trying to exhume the body of the man who was killed in the barn and compare it to the DNA of one of Wilkes's brothers to prove that in fact it was John Wilkes Booth, or to prove that there was a quote-unquote conspiracy or cover-up by the government. So, check it out tomorrow. If you're interested, go look up John Wilkes Booth, read the articles, and I will talk to you tomorrow. Have a great day. Get your workout on.